welcome back. So today we're going to be talking about is a little holiday lesson on Halloween. So we're going to talk a little bit about what is Halloween, where did it come from, and then kind of some of the traditions and some of the things that were associated with Halloween in the past. So Halloween began around 2,000 years ago in Ireland, England, and northern France with the ancient religion of the Celts. So they celebrated their new year on November 1st. So now this is kind of associated a little bit with an American holiday. It did start in Ireland, England, and northern France. So they celebrated the new year on November 1st. This day marked the beginning of the dark, cold winter, a time of year that was often associated with human death. So Samhain, on the night of October 31st, they celebrated Samhain when it was believed that the ghost of the dead returned to Earth. So oftentimes Halloween is associated with costumes because of that. So people thought that they would encounter ghosts if they left their homes, so they wore costumes. So this way the ghosts couldn't recognize them. There's also a Christian influence with this. So as the influence of Christianity spread into the lands in the 7th century, the Pope introduced All Saints' Day, a time to honor saints, to replace, the festival of Samhain. It was observed on May 13th. And then Pope Gregory III moved All Saints' Day from May 13th to November 1st. October 31st thus became the All Hallows' Eve. Hallow means saint. So a little bit about All Souls' Day. November 2nd, called All Souls' Day, is the day set apart in the Roman Catholic Church for kind of the commencement of the dead. And then another thing that's associated with Halloween is trick-or-treating. So with trick-or-treating, that began in the 15th century. So during All Souls' Day festival in England, people would beg for soul cakes made out of square pieces of bread, and families would give soul cakes in return for a promise to pray for the family's relatives. So then eventually, children, the practice was referred to going a-souling, was eventually taken up by children who would visit the houses in their neighborhoods and given all the food and money, things like that. It changed a little bit. So today, children still go from house to house, but instead of food and money, they get candy. It's a little bit about that history. So with Irish immigration, in 1848, millions of Irish immigrants poured into America as a result of the potato shortage or famine. They brought with them the traditions of Halloween. So that's how Halloween came to America. And so they called Halloween as their ancestors had, kept the traditional observances. So some things that are associated with Halloween again, the jack-o'-lantern. So how this came about was the Irish used to carry turnips with candles in them to light their way at night and to scare away any ghosts. Sorry. When they arrived in America, they found that pumpkins were both plentiful and easier to carve than turnips. So that kind of switched from turnips to pumpkins. So now jack-o'-lanterns are used for decorating people's homes. It's, a tradition to carve your jack-o'-lantern and make, very neat designs. Today people also go to parties, kids go trick-or-treating, eat lots of candy. So that's kind of just some of the traditions. I also wanted to talk a little bit about, some of the things associated with Halloween from the past and kind of how that came about. So there's going to be another part. So once again, this Halloween started with kind of the end of summer festival ending on October 31st, the Samhain festival. And this is where they believed dead spirits came back to life to find a body. So they made houses dark, wore costumes to fool spirits, and that's kind of how this tradition came about. So once again, there's many symbols of Halloween, trick-or-treating, jack-o'-lanterns, things like that. But I wanted to talk a little bit about, some of the kind of traditions or things that, happened in the past that are associated with Halloween today. So like vampires, witches, Frankenstein, things like that. Just wanted to, kind of talk a little bit about that. So one thing when you think of Halloween, you might think of witches. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that in the past and how that kind of ties into Halloween today. So anyone, who was thought as being different in the past, may have been accused as a witch. So especially people who might have challenged authority. And there were hundreds of thousands of people who were punished. And some of the symbols that were associated with witches were brooms, the pot, witch's pot, cat. And then also they kind of associated witches with, ugliness, evil is ugly. So that was kind of some of the things that they looked for. And they had witch trials. So from the 15th to 18th century, there were these witch trials. So the church declared witchcraft, as bad in 1320. Tens of thousands were victimized. And the way that they tested for witches, according to legend, was the skin doesn't bleed when poked. If your neighbor said that you could be accused. They might sink you in water, look for birthmarks. They might torture you until you confess. So things like that. And then they would punish them in many different ways. Another thing that happened with witches were the witch hunts. So people would accuse people who would accuse other people and so on. It was just kind of like a chain. And they would do punishment without any evidence. A famous, trial was the Salem witchcraft trial. So in 1692, in Massachusetts, 3 girls accused their neighbors. And then hundreds were accused. People died from this. May have had roots in disputes between 2 parts of Salem, which was a very famous trial. So another trial was the McCarthy hearings. So people were accused of being, communists, and that kind of led to the trials they had as well. But yeah, that's just a little bit about witches. So the next thing that's kind of associated with Halloween are vampires. And so, obviously this, these are legends. I'm not saying that any of this is true or not, just kind of fun things to talk about. So, vampires, there's a story present in many cultures that has to do with the idea that blood is life. So that's kind of what you think about with vampires, but you think of them during Halloween. So just thinking about, there were people who were accused of being real vampires. There's a famous case with Elizabeth Bathory. So she was afraid of growing old and that blood would revitalize her. She was caught by her brother, the king of Hungary, and kind of walled up in her own tower. So another interesting thing about this is the kind of man-made monsters. So thinking of like Frankenstein was something that was associated with, or is associated with, Halloween. So in 1818, it was a novel by 19-year-old Mary Shelley. Frankenstein was the name of the doctor, not the monster. So Frankenstein experiences the secrets of life, kind of tries to play God, and the consequences of playing God through science were seen. So when you think of Frankenstein, he's got his yellow skin, scarcely covered, the work of his muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was very black and flowing. His teeth were pearly white. But, these kind of inconsistencies only made more of a horrid kind of contrast with the watery eyes that seemed almost kind of a different color. So we kind of think about that with Halloween. So we think about witches, we think about vampires, man-made monsters. So another, thing associated with Halloween is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So in 1886, this was a novel by Robert Louis Stevenson, and it brings out, evil and a good doctor. So that's kind of something associated with Halloween. So another thing associated with Halloween is alien invasions. So our own technology is inadequate in the face of superior beings. So aliens may be kind of vampire-like, things like that. Another thing would be killer robots. And then Jack the Ripper was something that you kind of think about when you think of Halloween. So this was in Lizzie Borden as well. Ed Gein as well. I'm not going to really talk a little bit about them because you can look them up, but it's kind of, some horrific stories. Werewolves. So these were creatures present in many cultures. The wolf is greatly feared. And then there was also a Hollywood influence. So in 1941, the Universal movie The Wolfman had silver bullets, being bitten, there's pentagrams, things like that. Explanations. So there was also a Hollywood influence. So in 1941, there was a Universal movie called The Wolfman, starring Lon Chaney. It had, fortune tellers, pentagrams, being bitten, things like that. The Mummy is associated with Halloween. So, kind of a fascination with Egypt, things like that. Zombies are associated with Halloween. So, and then also modern zombies. So there's many movies about that, like The Night of the Living Dead, 28 Days Later. But yeah, that's kind of just some of the things that are associated with Halloween. But I hope that you enjoyed this video and just, are able to relax. And thanks for coming to the lesson today. I'll see you later.